And last but certainly not least, the man we're all here to see tonight, Right Worshipful Robert Johnson. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Right Worshipful. Your busy schedule and for making this happen. And so yeah, I'd love to turn it over to you because I'm just as eager as everybody else is to dive in and enjoy your presentation. So thanks again for
Hey, yeah, thanks. This was awesome to be able to basically do this virtually. It'll be maybe the third time I've been able to present for California. California actually is, born in Illinois, moved to California at a young age. My grades, my grade school alma mater is Evans Elementary in Garden Grove, and my heart's always there in California, and we moved back to Illinois after I got married, and we had my first son. So the first lodge I ever almost knocked on the door was the lodge at Orange Circle down there in Orange, California, in Orange County. And I got a little freaked out by the messaging on the door. I really didn't know what was going on, and then I was all over Wikipedia for 3-4 years before I eventually I sent my Grand Lodge an email. So I'm a successful web inquiry Mason, somebody who went through and got active and all that stuff and stayed in. But certainly not a rarity, I suppose, in this day and age. But anyway, I was just making some last-minute edits to the slideshow as I heard a few people in here were not Masons yet. And that wasn't to keep anything from you maliciously. It is literally to preserve the practice of Freemasonry so that not that anything can be nothing is going to be ruined for you. It's just that it will implant ideas before you want to have those ideas, right? There's a reason why you learn grammar, then rhetoric, logic. There's a reason you learn these things in succession, just like in mathematics. So with that, I guess I'll try to share my screen here. Let's see. All right, so I'll just kind of go into it. This is part of a 3-part series of lectures. It wasn't initially. I have 3 lectures that I go through typically. That one is they're called quantum series. But what it deals with is schools of wisdom, right? So that's kind of what Freemasonry is. So we'll talk a little bit about Freemasonry, its connections to esoteric thoughts, like other organizations and the topics of. But also, please remember that I first and foremost. My degree is a philosophy and religion, and I have my minor is in mathematics. So while I dive into a lot of this stuff, I'm also really, really intellectually honest about a lot of it. So I might say something, I might refer to something as not really that old or whatever the case is. Please don't take any of that as offensive or whatever. When I talk about that stuff, I'm talking about historical documented proofs, which obviously are not meant to, ruffle anybody's feathers. I'm just speaking regarding history. So the second part of this lecture series, not in this particular lecture, is about the Tetragrammaton. And the third is really about the idea of quantum physics, specifically emergent theory and the idea of apotheosis. So we'll start off with this handsome guy. His name is Werner Heisenberg, who won a Nobel Prize for his work in theoretical physics. And basically he's coined, right? It's not exactly, but if you look it up, he's coined as saying the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. And just kind of remember that as we go through, because what we're going to talk about are man's questions and how we went from really thinking about them philosophically to filling in those answers with our own imaginations, interpretations, archetypes, and things. And then maybe those things are really the same things that we study in science today. And what we're looking at are just really two different languages describing the same phenomena. So Esoterics 101. It's not really a 101. As I go through this, feel free to use your phone, take notes, send text messages, whatever. I'll just assume you're taking copious notes. Why did I develop this presentation? Well, so the reason for developing this was the famous story that I give is I was made a lodge education officer, and my lodge had never had one before. It was mandated by our area education officer, whom my lodge didn't even know existed. And they said, you're the new education officer. I was the junior warden, and I was supposed to give my first talk the following week. And so when I went in to give my talk, I talked about circumambulation, and the guy stood up and he said, "What does circumcision have to do with Freemasonry?" And so this was like a kind of a wake-up call. I was like, okay, I have to dial these things back, because clearly we've lost some sort of even cursory knowledge of some of the, I guess, more not quite as often used terms. Also, I'll apologize. I talk fast in this particular presentation because if I don't, I'll go all night. So the term esoteric, no great presentation on anything starts off without a definition. Webster's definition, right, to be specific. So esoteric, intended for or only likely understood by a few. Also, it means a chosen select. So by definition, Freemasonry is an esoteric society. We choose who we bring in. And ultimately, it's only understood by a few, even within our fraternity. There's a great book called The Master's Lectures. You should write it down. It's a great book if you can get a copy of it on eBay. If you really can't find it and you absolutely must have a copy of it, then and only then shoot me a message, and I'll see if I can put you in contact with Evans Lodge here in Illinois, who will sell you a copy. There is a famous quote within that book. I say famous because I love it, but something like, "Too many men coming through the West Gate that the fire of education has never been lit." Right? So we're in charge of who comes in. This is a small presentation that I put together for a lodge that I did out here. This is like an example of what esoteric refers to when I'm talking about containing it within the ritual of Freemasonry. Now, this presentation is typically given in a lodge, and we talk a little bit about some of the things contained. However, nothing I will show on the screen alludes to anything current, and if it is current, it's literally in the Bible. So how tiled is that? So this is an allusion to the meaning of 15 fellow crafts, and none of this is again, or just plainly written in any lectures or ritual anywhere. So that's my disclaimer. We are taught, so our Masons will find a lot of this really interesting. So we're just going to pull a conspiratorial thread here consisting of 3, 5, and 7 steps. This is the description of Solomon's temple in the Bible. Those 3, 5, and 7 adds up to 15. 35 cubits in height, 12 in circumference, 4 in diameter. Depending on your Bible, it will give slightly different variations. But if you add these up, these are taken from the King James Bible and also Illinois Standard Work. Those numbers, 3, 5, 1, 2, 4, equal 15. There were 15 conspirators. Solomon's temple employed 153,303 workmen. 153303. It's another 15. I'm waiting for the time that I added this up wrong, by the way, for somebody to go, that's 16, and then I'm shot. But this is the ancient accepted Scottish Rite ritual, 15th degree. You can pick this up on archive.org. This is circa 1884. So this ritual is not used anymore at all. However, and not in this form anyway, it talks about 42,360 captives. Now here's another reference to 15. So what's with the number 15? So this is where we diverge from any kind of ritual work, right? But some points to consider. Gematria, the number 15. 15 is equal to 10 and 5 in Gematria. 10 H and 5 is V, so it's Yud Hey. Also, 15 represents the Gematria for the word Had, meaning glory, splendor, majesty, beauty, grandeur, magnificence, and majestic splendor. For those who are listening, I heard one person say that they don't know anything about this stuff. Gematria, in short, is a series, a way to add number values to Hebrew letters and characters. And many times, numbers will be related to what is spelled out in the word. Not so if I said like the name of father and mother, if you add them up, their numerical value, maybe it equals a number that also means child. That's not the case, but this is what I'm talking about. So 15 always represents the elevation from physical to spiritual. So that elevation that I'm talking about has maybe a significant corollary, right? So the number 15 always signifies this idea of the 15 steps necessary for the attainment of a lofty objective. Okay, so 15 steps, lofty objective, Solomon's Temple, second degree. A sacred number, symbolic of the name of God. This is what Albert Mackey says in the Encyclopedia Kindred Sciences. What I should note also, though, is that what he mentions here in this is actually that in Gematria, or the Hebrew enumerations, 10 and 5 probably would never be used to make the number 15. Instead, it would be like 9 and 6, some other variants. But the fact that Masons do this with the numbers and the symbols doesn't discount the theory that I'm proposing. Why? Well, because as a society where we anglicize everything, we also write the Tetragrammaton from left to right instead of from right to left on many Masonic books from the early 20th century. Why? Because English people don't know how to write in Hebrew, right? They just wrote, oh, this is neat and sacred, and we'll just write it out, but it's not exactly correct. So not at all concerning, perhaps, that they would use the number 15 in this way when writing the lectures and degrees, whatever, 1730s or whatnot. It's really a product of the Enlightenment. So some conclusions on 15. Again, this is just an example of some of this stuff, but is used to reaffirm exactly what we're doing, right? Moving from the physical to the spiritual. It happens so often, perhaps not by mistake, that it's alluding to a transformation from material to spiritual, like a real constant reminder, right? Happens so often that it's not accident or coincidence, and could be a possible allusion to the idea of apotheosis or ascension, right? This is a lot of New Age thought that comes into this, but this is not necessarily New Age. This is, it's kind of Neoplatonic in a sense, which goes through several iterations and becomes, Shirley MacLaine, crystals, New Age stuff. That's what my mom's into. So now I want to give you another Werner Heisenberg quote. He says, "What we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." What he means by this is that we're only able to ask questions about what we know, like what we observe. And then when we ask those questions, we're trying to answer those questions with what can be observed. So we're only asking questions about things observed through a human meat suit, a filter. All right? So just remember that you're limited in senses by the machine that you're in. In 37 years, 37.5 trillion cells replicate, and literally after 7 years, you are no longer the same person, yet your consciousness remains. So how is that possible? Okay, so think about that. We're perceiving the world through a meat suit, a filter, a biological machine filter. If you like Voltron or any of those cartoons, that's what you're a mech. You're a thing in a thing. My kids ask all the time, what am I really? Well, nobody knows. You're a soul of consciousness inside this bio machine. So as we go through, that's an example of an esoteric concept that could be considered or talked about in a lodge. But Freemasonry is just perhaps one of these schools. There's a ton of them, right? So schools that discuss Kabbalah, you'll see it spelled with a C, a K, even a Q. Popular writers will describe the three versions as with a C, distinctly Christian. You can remember that because it's a C. K is traditional, and Q, magical, with it like MAGIK, like magic with a K. If that makes sense. The Pythagoreans, certain religious groups like Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, I'll use air quotes around Egyptian mystery schools. Later Greek mystery schools that did exist that we know of for sure through historical notes and documentation, which says that they learned what they learned from Egypt. Rosicrucianism, which is heavy in Freemasonry. The ideas of alchemy. Of course, Freemasonry being a wisdom school. The Bavarian Illuminati, no less. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Johannine or Johannite Christianity. Martinism, another one which is heavy in Freemasonry. Perhaps maybe in Freemasonry, maybe not. Depends on your lineage there, I guess. Boda or Builders of the Adytum, or Amorc, which is, again, that is Rosicrucianism, but is co-ed, and we'll move on. So what I want to do now is go through some of the slides here that will talk a little bit about each one of those schools. I want to make a note. I do see that there's 5, like, is in questions or whatever. I can't see the questions while I'm presenting, so I do apologize. I'm not ignoring you. If you've seen this before, this is a really popular idea. This is the Kabbalistic tree of life, and it's very difficult to ascertain what's going on here if you don't have an extensive knowledge in both Hebrew or the system. However, this is kind of one of the more, I don't know how to say it, pop culture-y iconography that you see all over, Facebook memes when we talk about, pop culture esotericism. This is another interesting example. It's the same thing. It's a tree of life, only here we see the addition of a couple things, right? So we have the limitless light at the top, the no limit, it's the Ein Sof, the nothing, which is the Ein. These are all Kabbalistic ideas. But in this representation here, you're also seeing the colors associated with each of these circles. These circles are spheres. They're called sephirot. Each one is representative of an attribute. So either divine masculine attributes, divine feminine. So things like wisdom, understanding, strength, mercy, beauty, victory, splendor, foundation. The kingdom is at the very bottom. It's called Malkuth. And that's where we live. It's a great book. It's called, Zohar. It's not like a dummy's guide, but it's basically like, the beginner's guide to the Zohar. My copy is pretty trashed on my bookshelf, but it fits in my back pocket. So anyway, it describes this as Keter at the top is this white, all-encompassing light. This is God, essentially, or God's light that comes through. It has to get filtered through all of these sephirot, all these circles, before it comes down to Malkuth, which is this idea that it's described like plugging something into a socket, and the socket's delivering way more than you can handle. So if you had a direct connection with God, you'd die. So it necessarily has to be filtered through everything. But also note the color scheme here. What we're starting to see with this image is not only the sephirot and the anglicizing by adding, what it actually means in English, we're also seeing this color scheme which aligns with chakras. This is the Tree of Life again, just put on the Flower of Life design. Notice the color scheme doesn't really change, and Malkuth is still kind of this weird quad colored amalgamation, which note that how that looks at the bottom on Malkuth later on when I show you a slide on the Rosicrucian cross. If this looks familiar, awesome, you're a friend of mine. This is a still frame of Donald Duck Goes to Mathemagic Land. And really what this slide is here for is to talk about the schools of Pythagoras and the Grecian schools. What we have with the Grecian schools are schools where people could go and talk about the secrets of the universe without being, killed for talking, and perhaps maybe the gods don't exist as they exist, or talking about the forms, or whatever the case is. And he's got this pentagram on his hand, and the pentagram here in this video even explains the pentagram as the rule of fifths. So it's nothing to do with evil or Satanism or anything. It actually is a mathematical symbol, and it's really kind of a shame that it's a cool symbol. We can't really use it. I have a ring that's got an owl on it and a pentagram. And I remember my grandmother going, "What is that? Is it satanic?" I'm like, no. Math minor, I had to teach her about the rule of fifths a little bit before she said, "Oh, okay." And also, if you hear some weirdness in the background, my daughter's playing Aladdin and Jasmine. Anyway, so what's interesting here is I would just recommend going on YouTube and typing in Donald Duck and Mathemagic Land and spend the 26 minutes or whatever it is watching it, because you're going to learn something. This is a cartoon designed for kids. And yet I watched it for the first time at 24, 25 years old, and my mind was like, what? I didn't learn any of this in school. What is this? So it just goes to show you kind of the declination of what's taught, I guess, in terms of classical or liberal arts in mathematics. But nonetheless, a cool place, the schools of Pythagoras and what was studied. If the plate on your left looks familiar, I think that's coming from Manly P. Hall's the Lost Keys of Freemasonry. Hall writes this book. He's world-renowned esoteric author. Really wrote a lot of what he wrote when he was just a wee baby in terms of esoteric knowledge and whatnot, and relied heavily on his contemporaries and dictated most of his books. But this slide really represents the idea of Gnosticism when I mentioned it in the schools of wisdom. So on your right, that keep calm and know thyself, this is the calling card to many organizations, notably the Gnostic type of motto. It is to know yourself, because by knowing yourself, you might know deity a little bit better. And take that how you want it, but it does allude partially to the idea of the divinity within man. The image on top of that, you see this old guy, and it's always, always, always attributed. It's like, oh, it's God applying the compasses. Well, this isn't God, actually. This is one of the archangels. I just can't remember his name at the time, so I apologize, but it's an archangel applying the compasses. And moving on, this is the inside left plate of Manly P. Hall's the Lost Keys of Freemasonry. I just think it's an interesting thing to note. This is an Egyptian, it's a narrative based on an Egyptian ritual where a priest, a kid becomes an initiate, and he becomes an Egyptian priest. Pretty interesting stuff. This slide, this is the Rosicrucian slide. Now, the plate on your left, I really wish my pointer doesn't really work in this aspect. But anyway, on the top middle portion of this plate, of this image, right, you see this castle on wheels, a fortress, with all kinds of things, these birds with words diving down. And in the top center is the tetragrammaton, actually written correctly, right? So right to left. And the idea behind these plates is that just like a tracing board, it tells a story without having to write out a lecture. And this is, if you've ever gone on eBay or anything and you look up old symbol books, that's really kind of neat, because symbol books really, or emblem books as they're called, have just a symbol, and you would teach by an emblem rather than words, because as we all know, most folks back then, reading wasn't, very spread. The image on the right is this Rosicrucian cross. That color scheme I talked about at the bottom there is the same as it in Malkuth. Now this comes direct, from a Masonic body, right? This comes from the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. And so what's interesting about that is here now you have this same allusion to a Kabbalistic concept. And also, not to be outdone, you also have alchemical symbols all over this thing for salt, mercury, and what else is on there? Yeah. And then you have initials, INRI, just tons of symbolism. But what I'm getting at with all of this is there's layover. There's a similar thread that runs through all of it. The Bavarian Illuminati, the plate on your left is Adam Weishaupt. If you want to know more about the Illuminati and all of these things, I cannot recommend Joseph Wage's book, The Secret School of Wisdom, enough. And he also published recently another book of the writings of Weishaupt. Phenomenal texts. Not without their, these aren't like philosophical gold mines. They're philosophical texts, and they're really cool. But not everything, you're not going to take everything to the bank. The Illuminati gets a bad rap. If you've read the book, you know that they stood for some really amazing things. One of them is the idea of elevation of mind. So while a Mason could become a member of the Bavarian Illuminati, in fact, preferred at a later time, the basis is to have you present papers and influence your society. And if you've watched, I don't think there's a Mason out there today, maybe, who hasn't seen, I think Johnny Royal did a film, Illuminated, which is another wonderful, wonderful piece of film that I can't recommend enough if you have interest in this. But they get a bad rap, they're shut down. And again, what are they teaching? What are they after? Ultimately, it's more of an objective truth, which is without an archetype, I suppose. Whereas these other schools are systems. They are systems that allow you to get to an objective truth. Right, so taking a step back, taking a step back, taking a step back, right, and we're looking at all of the things so that you can see how they interconnect and what they have that's similar, and then maybe that most similar thing is the true concept. If this looks familiar, you don't just try to keep a poker face. This is a temple of Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Notice the similar imagery. Even the piece down in the bottom right, this is a Kabbalistic sort of diagram that is used in the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn, very similar officer setup. They have some interesting rituals you could probably look up on Vimeo, most likely. The ideas of the pillars. In fact, they're more so in line with Masonic tenets here than they are even in Freemasonry. What do we say? That the pillars are the archives of Masonry to guard against inundation or conflagration or fire and flood. Well, the archives of Masonry are typically this idea of all of the teachings of mankind, the knowledge, right? And they're inscribed on the two pillars so that when God comes knocking on the door and he decides to destroy the world by one of two ways, we won't have to start over again. Isaac Asimov wrote a great book, a series of books called Foundation, and in it, one of the there's a colony that goes to a planet that is charged with creating something called the Encyclopedia Galactica, and the idea is they preserve all of the knowledge of the galaxy because impending doom is coming, and they will return to an age of barbarism. So in order to not have to start over, everything is encoded. And so this is the similar idea. This is another Kabbalistic tree. This one, however, includes also the tarot. This comes directly from the builders of the Adytum. Something I am a member of Boda, and it's heavily anchored in tarot symbolism, in terms of not like a magical predict the future or conjure demons, because none of that is what tarot is for. It's really a psychological tool. Understand yourself, right? And what's the main goal? Know yourself, because by knowing yourself, this tangible thing that you are, maybe you know God a little better. And then, of course, there's Amorc, Ancient Mystics of the Rose Croix. So Amorc is a co-ed order. There is I don't know if it's written or not, but I'll blow the secret right now, and that is that if you are a known member of Amorc, you will not be invited to the SRICA or SRIF, which is a Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, or Federalis if you're in Europe. And that just because I think there's just contentions that exist. But what about Freemasonry? Oh, also, everything I mentioned previous to Freemasonry is pretty much co-ed too. So ladies joined that. We're the holdout. So with Freemasonry, we look for hidden truths, but again, not everything is in plain sight. So I'll show a couple slides here and make some commentary. Masons will get some of this, I'm sure, right away. Senior and junior deacons in this image, right? This is just a classic representation. Again, if there's something here that you go, oh, I didn't get this, tell me about this. When you shoot me an email later, we can talk about it. The entered apprentice degree. Every degree has an obligation, and we describe this symbol. But we also have allusion to Egyptian ritual, which many people say, oh, any allusion to Egypt, we're not Egyptian, we're not Egyptian, we're not Egyptian. And that is correct. We are somewhat Egyptian due to what we would call cultural appropriation through means of migratory patterns and wars and taking over things. And then eventually these things get rediscovered and they are cool. And then through the Renaissance and eventual Enlightenment period, and then the third degree ritual is written. This is the trait. This is the thread that you pull to find how it's Egyptian. But when we look at a lot of the things in the Egyptian ritual, it's pretty similar. The thing I'm about to show you comes from a book by Milton A. Pottinger. Probably, it used to be my favorite Masonic book. Probably not my favorite Masonic book anymore. Probably my second favorite. But the book is called Symbolism, a Treatise on the Soul of Things. And there is it's got a really long title, but that's the first part of it. This image appears. And it's talking about how Isis is in the West and Osiris is dead. This image is not known to be in any actual tomb. So it's not actually like a thing. I don't think. I think Pottinger drew it to make a point, but it was interesting nonetheless. But that allusion to the Egyptian ritual, right? So you have what we call Thoth or Tehoti, or it's really pronounced Jehuti. but also this idea of the emerald tablets. The emerald tablets, this is a cool reproduction. I think it's like $2,500 if you want to get one, made of green glass. But this idea, the Thoth tablet or Jehuti tablet is supposed to have all of the information for mankind on it, which was bestowed onto mankind. Boy, that sounds like the pillars, kind of. And so we see that this idea of an archetype, or in Freemasonry, sometimes people go through these massive rituals, just like you would have seen in ancient Egypt, right? Or in even the Grecian schools, the school Eleusis and Dionysus. Of course, people went through something, but there was no nobody was maybe there was an exemplar, but most likely it was a play that you watched. So when people talk about, 1 degree, one dude, 1 degree, one dude, and it's like, that's the way. I mean, historically, it's probably not the way. But if you want to do it the way they did it, you probably need some hallucinogenic drugs also. However, what I'm talking about here, though, is archetypes, meaning an exemplar. So the perfect form. So you think about like Plato's forms, Plato's perfect form. So the perfect form of something, and then we create like little offshoots, right? So like, what's the perfect superhero, and then we've got DC and Superman. You got Captain Marvel over here, right? They're really similar. They're archetypes of the same kind of idea, the perfect form. And so what we see with this is perhaps an archetype of a key to knowledge, something that was preserved. But then we look at the people involved, right? We had like, these are just some notes I had. This was to make sure I talked about the idea of transmission. I think I have Bacchus comes before Zagreus, but then it's Zagreus and Dionysus and Eleusis. And then you see some slight variations, goes into Mithras. And then I have a note on here for Gnostic Christianity, because you do see this link between cults of Mithras and Rome and Gnostic Christianity, which, is a spring, 300 years later. But this idea that in this one Mithric temple room, there's a mosaic of Jesus dressed as a Roman soldier. And this is crazy because it really shows the adaptation as we go from a concept of a transmission of wisdom, a esoteric truth, through all of these systems, and then down, and then it kind of gets culturally appropriated as it goes and changes little by little until it's adopted somewhere else. And then we eventually see it in Rosicrucianism. Rosicrucianism, there's a lot of, hoopla about Rosicrucianism, but the fact remains, historical fact, is that it is started as a Masonic thing that claims a kind of a revealed, it's dubious, we'll say that. And then Masonry basically takes it and makes it its own. But these ideas of common archetypes. So if I showed you this picture of Enoch, and then I showed you a picture of, what's supposed to be Hermes Trismegistus, or Trismegistus, however you want to say it, and even Hiram Abiff. These are all like examples of common factors. The idea of a stylized version for your system. I want to study this. Well, here's that version here. If you want to look at Gilgamesh and here, and then you want to look at Noah, right? Like, same story. But they're all in these systems. So it's like the wagon wheel. I think somebody posted a meme one time of the Dalai Lama, and he refers to the many paths of like the wagon wheel, right? Many paths, one same center. So that's really a key thing here. But a common factor in a lot of this stuff is the idea of the tetragrammaton, but not, I'm skipping over this slide, and I'm skipping over that slide, and that slide, and that slide. The tetragrammaton, the reason I I mention that is because the Tetragrammaton itself is somewhat of an allusion to also the idea of the divinity within man. So this is the Tetragrammaton as it is, written grammatically, Yod He Vav He. Okay. And then what I'm about to show you next is the work of the late and great Dr. Bruce S. Fisher, former all-around genius, professor at MIT, was a member of regular Masonry for a number of years before his wife said, I'm curious about Freemasonry, and she joined a co-Masonic lodge, and then he said, all right, I'm out. So he left regular Masonry and joined a co-Masonic lodge and stayed there with his wife. For years, Bruce and I and a friend of mine, Jonathan, my writing partner for many years, would get together and we'd have talks with Bruce. And Bruce really got us going on some of this. Now, the idea of the gematria really comes into full effect in this particular image, because now he's used something called the tetractys or the tetracitus that we see in Royal Arch Masonry. We see that, and instead he uses the forms of the Tetragrammaton, and it leads up to this idea of 72. And I said, Bruce, I'm lost. I don't get it. And Bruce said, well, if you have 5 angles of 72, that's the rule of fifths. That's a 360-degree circle. And I said, okay. And he said, well, the pentagram is a classic example. It is a signal for the idea of man. So you have the idea of man, 72, each angle times 5. You have the 360 circle, which is God, right? It's the idea of a 360-degree circle. So really interesting stuff. I've even seen in some pop culture stuff, they'll refer to, Allah is arm, leg, arm, head. Of course, if you speak the language, it's not exactly how it works at all. This is just anglicized stuff. So what is the meaning or the purpose of a lot of this stuff? Again, I somewhat alluded to this idea of relating to divinity within man. But the idea is to the truth. Origin. Origin is really interesting to me specifically. And I think to a lot of people, we ask this idea of who am I? Where did I come from? All of these things. And really, we say, well, what's the oldest? What's the oldest version of this truth? And we find it. We're like, that must be it. It's Kabbalah. Oh, wait. Kabbalah is 11th century in some of its most modern forms. I guess it's not that old. What came before it? Oh, Neoplatonic thought, Iamblichus and Philo-Judaeus. What's before them? Plato's forms. What's before them? And so you just keep jumping back. We have this need to find, because the older it is, the more true it must be, right? Because it's less polluted or something, right? So we're always looking for this truth. But the fact is that all of these systems have a truth. They really do, even Freemasonry. It leads to this idea of self-realization, the divinity of man. And I'm not being blasphemous here. I'm not, we say that, God creates man in his own image in the Christian text and in the Hebraic text, right? If you want to get crazy, start thinking about how man starts creating robots in our image, right? So we are the creators now. But this is the common denominator in all systems. It's this idea of divinity in man. Of man, maybe. There's a famous, that's not really famous. I guess it's just a staple within the world of physics. And that is, nothing exists without man's perception of its existence. And this is true. If you're interested in the Illinois Intender book from 1972 and 1998, let me know. It talks about the Temple of Man a little bit. An official Grand Lodge document talking about the Temple of Man. What? I mean, that's just crazy. You guys may find it interesting to note that your own Grand Lodge, California, I think it's like 1930 or 1919. Well, what it basically says is that your education committee chair stands up in front of his Grand Lodge and delivers an oration about how they are charged to deliver Masonic education. And yet, the problem is that nothing is considered fact in terms of what's being taught other than the ritual. And he says, well, you already have a ritual committee. So here we are. The quandary is an education committee charged to disperse official statements where we're not allowed to make official statements. What are we teaching? We have no official doctrine. We have no nothing. So what are we even doing? And so what I'm trying to convey with at least some of this is to look at the bits of truth in all these systems, no matter how wild, hokey you might think some of them are. Remember, these are just systems to lead you somewhere that you might identify with. Freemasonry is a system. And I think, in my own personal view, I'm not alone, that there is a core dogma of Freemasonry. I have a note on here as the arc and the mind. You might find the work of P.D. Newman especially interesting in this aspect, but the idea centrally is that as the Ark of the Covenant, is the throne of God when on earth. So where is the Ark? It's supposed to be in the Holy of Holies, and according to the Phoenician temple layout, it's at the top. And if you look above at the temple looking down, it is perhaps the mind, or Dr. Rick Strassman will tell you it's the pineal gland. So God's throne on earth is, the pineal gland, which relates to dimethyltryptamine and all of that good stuff. But, this quick note on George Plumer. Earlier, I said that it's my second favorite book by Milton A. Pottinger, Symbolism, A Treatise on the Soul of Things, which, by the way, archive.org, you'll get a free PDF copy all day long. But I think if you want an in-print copy, you can get one from Kessinger for $30. It's a hardback, and $10 for a softback. George Plumer took over this number one spot for me. He wrote a book called The Master's Word. It's a short book, 120 pages, but worth every word you read. George Plumer is a Masonic Rosicrucian, I should say. He's a member of Societas Rosicruciae in Anglia. Wrote the book 60 years ago. Ish. If you have an original copy, it probably will go for $350 to $400. Again, Kessinger, $10 reprint. You might get somebody else's notes in there, right? Because it's a facsimile, but a powerful book nonetheless. And the reason I have the brackets around self-realization and divinity of man is because George Plumer, from this high state of Rosicrucian philosophy, and he really wrote the book as a Freemason, writing the book for a wide audience of anybody who was interested in knowing objective truth. He says, it's interesting to note that the ideas that come to man come to various men at one stage in human evolution when we're ready. So he alludes to the idea of the singular consciousness that somehow we connect with, whether you want to call that Akashic or something else, that we connect with it when we're ready to receive it, which, if you're fans of the Whence Came You podcast, I just had a dude who did a paper on the temple in Genesis, which really talks a lot about this, and it's fascinating. So check that episode out. Sorry about the shameless plug there, but it just popped into my head. But this is a great idea. And his example is Nikola Tesla and Marconi. These guys all filed patents, separated by at least 1,000 miles. And, this is not at a time where they're, off emailing each other and, sniping each other's emails and getting each other's patents for the ideas of radio telecommunications. So the idea is these ideas come from somewhere when we're ready. And by the way, something interesting to note, I talked about that singular consciousness. That singular consciousness really comes in the ideas, there's the ideas of the four fundamental forces in physics, which are strong and weak interactions, gravity, somebody out there is probably going to yell at me. Gravitational, strong and weak, electromagnetic. So those are the four fundamental forces that interact on all aspects of reality. But if you ask if the human intellect can be measured, do the laws of thermodynamics apply? The answer is currently yes. And what that implies is that perhaps consciousness is a fifth fundamental force. Just food for thought. There's a couple great papers on that. This is a map that you may or may not have seen or seen ones like it. It's the anatomy occulti, right? So Temple of Solomon, the other right side is the Castle de Camelot. But the idea here is really simple too. It's this, I don't know if I want to get into the idea of the illusion of duality here, but on the right is the idea of Castle de Camelot, which is supposed to be an idea of imaginary. It's imaginary. It wasn't like, it's not real in the sense. Excuse me. So it's not real in this sense, right? But on the left, we have the Temple of Solomon, which we know is real. So you're looking at non-corporeal and corporeal existence. You're looking at, all these dualistic features. But what's represented on this thing is just fascinating. Man, Kabbalah, astrology, Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, Christianity, Golden Dawn, the Hermetic order, that is, alchemy, science, elemental forces. Some people say, well, what about OTO, Ordo Templi, or AA or whatever? That's really kind of all rolled up under Golden Dawns. It's kind of born out of that. But the idea here is that all of this is just thrown up on this. I mean, it's just barfed out. What does any of this even mean? Well, most of it is in there's Portuguese and there's Italian. I've been relying on my mom for some of the Italian translations. But really what we're seeing is on the left side, there's these brackets, which are the it's like 5, maybe 6 original churches set up after Christ's death. You have the ideas of positive and magnetic polarities on the human mind, represented in the top right. It's just all this stuff. What does it mean? I've been working for 4.5 years, in my leisurely time, deciphering a lot of this. But what this is, it's just a key. It's saying, if you study this, it's the same in here, 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 and here. I mean, we have chakras, the Kabbalistic tree, the idea of equilibrium running through. It's all very similar. As we kind of wrap this up, the idea is to talk to you about the reduction and the banning. So during the 1700s to 1915, Siri didn't get that. 1700 to 1915, Golden Age, right? This is the idea of a lot of the great esoteric texts are written. After this, we have an influx of membership that weren't really into the esoteric, and that's because Freemasonry served a wonderful kind of, supply-demand curve, where Freemasonry had social events and the demand for social events was there, and it was right at that peak, which is interesting. So as we've kind of lost a lot of that esoteric edge. You also have the dissolution of the Bavarian Illuminati, which hurt the movement in terms of philosophy moving forward in many respects. You have the creation of state lodges of research. And what's interesting too to note is if you look at some of these dates, it really leaves a large, wide chasm for various things to fill. And things like theosophy, spiritualism as a full-blown religion, all come through this. The creation of outside orders. You look at the things that A.E. Waite was joining, or the things that you can look at McGregor Mathers, or any of these folks. And then there's the term the Blue Lodge waiting room. This is the idea. Some people get mad when I use this term, and that's because when I joined Masonry, I didn't exactly get what I wanted. So I kind of considered Blue Lodge the waiting room until I could go somewhere and talk to some guys who, quote unquote, really get it. And here's the truth is that there are tons of dudes who really get it. They're not all, some people just don't talk about this stuff, and that's okay. But if you're like me, there are tons of people out there to talk about this stuff. And it's not to say I don't enjoy typical Freemasonry, because I sure love it. And I miss going back to lodge. And lastly, on this particular slide, the banning of the term esoteric in New Zealand. So weird is the term esoteric that in New Zealand, they actually banned it. I think it's like 6 or 7 years ago, their Grand Master put out an edict that if you use the term, you can forget about it. Like, you're out, or you'll be reprimanded or something. So, that's all well and good. But a lot of this, people say, why does this matter? Okay, why does it matter to the modern man? And really, it's just 5 things, right? It's the idea of enlightenment, to look for an objective form of truth, right? Which might align with spirituality a little bit. People today are very spiritual. They might not be going to churches or going to temple or whatever, but they are more spiritual than ever. I would assume. I would just say, honor, right? Because by the practice of a lot of the things that we're taught in these schools, we learn the idea of, holding yourself up. The ideas of chivalry, right? We see that all throughout a lot of the knighted orders. Understanding. As a friend of mine, his name is David, and I think he's in Indiana. And he came to me to talk to me about the idea of steel manning. And this is the idea that you're going to listen to what I have to say. You're going to repeat it back to me. And then you're going to tell me if you agree or disagree. After I say, yeah, you got it. So the idea of truly understanding, and we do this in lodge, right? Like, you talk to your worshipful master, and your master is kind of the interlocutor for the entire lodge, the person who says, yep, you can talk. Now you can talk. Well, let's see where we, align, right? And think about how that works. And so we're about understanding. It teaches these things. Also, it teaches the idea of the masculine and feminine, the warrior poet. And this is crucial, because when we have brothers who come to lodge, we say a lot of the times, I want to cry with you and I want to be happy with you because you are my brother, to form a real bond, not superficial stuff, right? If somebody asks me, oh, they want to talk about they say, if you talk about the weather, that's the filler when you have nothing to talk about. So to that end, right, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Well, you're looking good. Well, look better to be seen than viewed, or, whatever all these weird, goofy platitudes we use when we go to lodge. What are we really talking about? And there's those true connections to be able to be emotional with our brothers, with our sisters, whatever the case is. So just keep that kind of thing in mind, is things that Masonry teaches us. If you've seen this before, this is on the cover of one of my favorite books. And it's this idea of this guy, right? And he's kind of looking out past the known universe to see how the wheels of creation work, right? But when he comes back, there's no going back. Once you ring the bell, you can't unring it. So this is the idea of becoming enlightened. And this is, this is an Enlightenment era type image. And for today, maybe this is probably a little bit more appropriate, right? Alice looking behind the curtain to see the code. But this is the idea. This is what we're looking for. Michio Kaku is a world-renowned physicist, and he talks about the 1-inch equation. The 1-inch equation to make sense of all things. I think it's possible, right? I mean, I could talk your ear off about the receding pocket and all this, but to go back to Werner Heisenberg, he's got this idea, right? So we go through, we've presented some wild, crazy stuff. Then we look at the mathematics and what people are studying back then and how it relates to today. Well, I mean, I guess I'll leave you with this fact, right? Is that when I said nothing exists without man's perception of its existing, if you believe in science that says that, right, this provable, demonstratable science, we've also proven that in order for something to exist, it has to have been observed. And if you believe in the Big Bang, then something had to observe it. And so mean, I'm not talking circles about anything. That's just facts. Science doesn't need us to agree with it to be true. So I want you to bring back esoteric, right? A renaissance in the craft. And that means if you want to dissect the chaplain's prayers, do it. If you want to look at any element of the ritual, pull it out, see what it really means. Talk to your brothers about it and pull the red thread and go off the deep end. Really explore it, because that's really kind of the mystery. This is the system you're in, or at least you're interested in, right? You're here in a Masonic lodges who decided to come together and allow me to come over here and rant about this kind of stuff for however long I've been talking. But just bring it back, do your part, and really don't discount it. Have an open mind. If it's not your cup of tea, that's okay also, but try to add something to the conversation and be understanding of those who are, in fact, into some of this. There's a lot of esoteric concepts that are contained within the world's religions. We don't discount those so easily, do we? So if you're interested, there's this is 1 year ago on here, but this is like 6 years ago. We did an episode number 15 on Masonic Roundtable of this. But what's next? A couple of presentations I talked to you already about. Not Totally Crazy, right? I wrote a business book with my good friend John Ruark, fellow occultist and tarot artist. But there's no tarot in this book. This is all about adapting some corporate tactics for success for Freemasonry. And then, of course, I'm all of these other places. And that's my email address. So write that down. And I will provide you with citations, bibliographies of all the books that I used to compile this presentation and things I've read over the years. But also you'll get a link to an anonymous peer review request. And that's what I need from you. So that would be super. Whether you have good feedback, bad feedback, I'm a grown man. I'll handle it. So you let me know how I did, if I moved too fast, too slow, if you thought things were disjointed, whatever. I want to know about it. So that's all I have. I'm going to mute myself now, if I can figure this out. Yep, so it's still there, and give you back control. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for very insightful presentation, right, Worshipful. So there's a lot of people here who have their minds blown and who have been Googling and talking in the Zoom group chat about the different topics as you've been talking about it. So certainly sparks a lot of conversation. And if anybody's heard of, which we have, your podcasts, I know there's never a dull moment in those. So let's see. We do have a quick question from a dear brother of ours who asks, is the tree of life from Genesis 2:16? Oh, that's the first question. Is the tree of life from Genesis 2:16? And if not, or if it is, why did God say to Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree? Was it that the punishment was death from sin?
So philosophically, when we're looking at that tree of life, you can ask any religious leader that question, you're going to get a different answer.
Sure.
But traditionally, like from a philosophical point of view, remember there's two trees. There's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And so the tree of life is different from the tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge says if you eat from the tree of knowledge, you're going to know things. And this is what a good friend of mine just wrote in a recent paper. He was talking about God was not upset that you ate from the tree of knowledge, right? Because it's not. Why would God not want you to know things?
Sure.
That seems really, really spiteful. Like, what a ding dong! Like, I don't want that God. I want a God who's like, I want to empower you, right? And that's the God that we know. That's the God we love. The God of empowerment. The God who shares and loves and cares for everybody. So with that idea, it's not that God didn't want you to eat from it. It's that He didn't want you to eat from it yet. Right? It's this idea you weren't ready for it yet. But of course, we do this thing. I've read some really interesting papers regarding the idea. It's a emergent theory. It's a mathematical concept that's related to the idea of the tree of life. So if you follow me for just a second, that is this idea that as we perceive things, they become real. So an idea of that is a famous thing called the double slit experiment. Google that, check it out. It's fantastic. It's awesome. But what it says is that when we observe matter, it actually changes when we observe it. So by that effect, perhaps the idea of now you have to die because you know about death. You know about death, so it affirms a belief that it exists and therefore makes it a thing. So before you knew that death was a thing, it didn't exist. So there's a lot to unpack there, but again, the journey's in the unpacking. I mean, I can tell you all day 2 + 2 is 4, but it doesn't. I don't know how to explain it, right? Like there are literally a infinite number of numbers between 1 and 2, 1.9, and on and on and on, right? But somehow our brains go 1, 2, and that's amazing that we can conceptualize that. But the journey's in like kind of the process of thought. I'm not sure I answered that question at all, but
and that's such a just like you said, it's a very interesting question, and everybody kind of has their own opinions and philosophies about it, which is the beautiful thing in Masonry, in my humble opinion, that we can all come together and kind of put these ideas together. When essentially, in my thought process as a Mason, it's we are the allegorical representations of that temple, and we are building ourselves through our tools to become that better person.
That's precisely exactly it. The Illinois Intender Manual states that when we say we're building that house, right? So it said it on a TV program. It said that house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. What's a house not made with hands? What are the tools, if not the tools of your self-consciousness? Why does the worshipful master act as the interlocutor between two halves of the lodge? What are these things? You guys read a book, Kirk McNulty. I'm going to look at my bookshelf. I can't see it. I'm blind. Anyway, Kirk McNulty wrote this fantastic book. I'll get, if you write me or whatever, I'll make sure I add it in here. But consciousness elements, represented as archetypes in the lodge. All of these things, I mean, that's what we're talking about. Those tools, no tool of, iron. Well, these are tools of your mind to better yourself in order to build the temple that is you, right? But we say it in ritual, but I mean, it still goes over a lot of people's heads. They're just thinking, oh, that's the story that we use to bring you through a degree, But you're right, 100%.
Anybody else have any questions for Right Worship? I know it's a couple hours ahead of us, so we certainly don't want to keep you up all night, although...
I'm up all night anyway. I'm a student. But yeah, it's fine. Whatever you guys need.
Jonathan Williams has his hand raised, it looks like, in the participants. Did you have something to say, Jonathan?
Yeah, you mentioned the Golden Dawn and the different pieces. Have you ever tried to do the LBRP in English as opposed to Hebrew?
Nope.
Yeah. That's an honest answer.
Yeah, so I am very familiar with the Golden Dawn's work as what's been published in terms of their self-initiation rituals and some of their books. Same with Ordo Templi Orientis. In a lot of these schools, and my particular path with one that I identify with is through the work on mind, right? Objective truth, subjective consciousness, the study of science and how we look at these things. And so for me, I've always looked at Boda has been the way to go for me because it's easy for me to identify with concepts on cards. But, everybody has a thing. So for, I'm just not 100% on the work of Golden Dawn in the way that you've asked about it.
Very cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Steve McIntosh.
You mentioned the OTO. Well, AA is based on the Golden Dawn. OTO isn't.
Right. The OTO existed alongside of the Golden Dawn.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap in
Yeah.
ideas, but the system is based off of the stages of a person's life, from conception, life, birth, life, death, and afterlife.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. I've read some of the Reformed Ritual of Crowley. Yeah, I mean it's good stuff. I think it makes some strange divergences.
Yeah, well, it's not based on the Golden Dawn.
Right.
The AA system is based on the Golden Dawn, but more individual, single student, single teacher. But the OTO is a totally different pattern.
Thank you.
Does any, I know we have a couple people who are non-Masons. This wasn't necessarily like a introductory to Masonry by any means. This is more on the esotericism, but did you guys have any questions, seeing as how it wasn't technically Masonry, but yet it involves Masonry? Did you guys have any questions, or are you guys okay?
What are the best ways a lodge could pursue Masonic esoteric renaissance?
That's a great question. And truly the answer is, number one, if you're a candidate in search of, a path like this or something similar, and Freemasonry is the way you want to go, then I would be open and honest about your expectation when going to a lodge, because every lodge does have a flavor. Some will be receptive to this. Some have groups within and study groups, and that's awesome also. And some groups and some lodges just are straight up. I mean, they're kind of like me sometimes. They're just out there, right? The way you want to, in my opinion, to bring about this kind of thing is to, number one, introduce the idea and ask questions about it. Number two is really to understand that the men who are in your lodge, they are your brothers first and foremost, and so they should care about what you want also. We have a practice at Space Novum. It's my lodge. It's a new lodge that we created, but one of the things that we realized that we said was that Spencer Hammond, who is my junior warden, if Spencer Hammond wants to know more, he's a luthier by trade, so a violin maker. If he wants to know more about music theory and how it relates to Freemasonry, then all of us want to know more about music theory and Freemasonry. Because what we want to do is we want to be fulfilling to that member. And so if that's you and you want to bring that, how do you bring that about? Then I think it's kind of it's a double-edged sword. I hate when people say be the change, but there's truth to that. We do want to be the change, and sometimes that means being a little bit more active than we have the nerve to be. But I think if you want it, you just have to be open and honest about it and ask for it.
Thank you.
So last quick question, Worshipful. So I'm noticing pretty good point to say, Grand Lodge should, have each individual lodge, kind of create a lodge education officer. So I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, in your opinion, would that be the senior warden with oversight of the master? Or how would you interpret the lodge?
Like the lodge education officer, you mean?
Correct, yes.
So Illinois is interesting. Each state is a little different, and we didn't really know. And the thing was that we had this guy who is the area education officer who came and he said, you need a lodge education officer, an LEO. And they just appointed me. And at that time I was a senior warden, and I also had a podcast. So I was just like the de facto guy.
Yeah, you're the guy.
And so what's happened in 10 years now, this last year or 2 years ago, we instituted the first ever state education officer. Now here's the thing, and here's what was important was this. The state education officer, who does he report to? Only the Grand Master. Only the Grand Master. Who's under the state education officer? An area education officer. We have 5 areas in Illinois. And in each area, we have a district education officer. And in each district, we have lodges. And in each lodge, a lodge education officer. So we've created a chain of command. And what this has enabled us to do, right, is to fundamentally change the structure. Because for years, a district education officer would be chosen, and they reported to the district deputy grand master. So I'm gonna say something not PC here, but to place perhaps one of your more educated people, an education officer, who is charged to speak on educational philosophical topics under the thumb of somebody who is only there administratively to be like their bitch or their secretary is not cool. So what we did was we shifted them and said, nope, the district education officer doesn't report to the DDGM anymore. In fact, he's their equal. And you know the pushback we got was, they're not going to be right worshipful, are they?
Dang.
Because our DDGMs are right worshipful. So this should give you a clue to the shift. Like there's a problem. There's a fundamental problem with there's camps, and we really can't have that. So what we did was we said we have to empower the educators to have a line of communication up the top. And this has worked really, really well. And now our DDGMs kind of get it. But the message still from Grand Lodge is the DEOs, the district education officers, for official visits, or maybe you guys do inspections. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we have the district inspectors. I was figuring that might be the same.
Yep, same thing, right? So depending on the type of visit, the district education officer, you decide this. I'm not going to give my opinion here, but I think you'll guess it. At an official inspection or whatever, if your district education officer comes out, and at that official communication, all he's supposed to talk about are the Grand Lodge charities, or like Grand Lodge stuff.
Corporate stuff. I mean, is he really being an education officer, or is he just like that's what the DDGM, in my opinion, is for. But it's about empowerment. Empower your educators to do that stuff. By default, in every lodge in Illinois, if you have no lodge education officer, it is the worshipful master. It's interesting, kind of think about Andrew Verdi's question just now, or as far as like, what was your question again, Andrew? The way you articulated that.
Thank you. Asked, what are the best ways that a lodge could pursue Masonic esoteric renaissance?
Okay, so just to caveat off that, from what we've been talking about, I feel that there's been almost a renaissance, like you said, of, hey, like Masonry isn't just cookies and milk at the end of a meeting after we talk about paying our bills. So there was this, and I thought there's been this again, I'll just say renaissance to the esoteric Mason, the mystic Mason, which Manly P. Hall's talked about on numerous occasions. So it's interesting stuff. I think we're in a new era.
I think as somebody who was just raised last May, I came into it for the more esoteric side, and I came into a lodge, and that was a lot of sort of the old school guys, right? They were sort of the 50s, 60s, 70s Renaissance era Masons, One or two of them might have been into more of the esoteric side stuff, but for the most part, we went through the degrees without learning a lot of the symbolism behind the degrees, and I found myself constantly asking for that symbolism, and I was not getting a lot of answers. And so one thing I would say is, like, I love the idea of an educational officer in the lodge, and we would occasionally do esoteric educational stuff. Someone would come out and read a paper or something. But I'm curious, worshipful, who decides the curriculum for what you're teaching? Right? Is someone saying this is okay to teach, this is not okay to teach? Because I think everybody, from what I've seen going 3 or 4 different lodges, everybody comes at it from a different angle. You have your supper club Masons, you have your esoteric Masons, you have and then so what are we deciding is worth or okay to teach?
Can I show you guys something since I'm still screen sharing?
Yes.
Okay. So here's what we've implemented here in Illinois. Now, the Grand Lodge of Illinois website's really awesome and amazing, but the problem is that we can't get them to put anything up on education, even when we ping them. So I run the Illinois Lodge of Research. I'm the webmaster here. So I've offered to allow our Grand Lodge education to have a little place to stay.
Nice.
All right. So we have monthly themes. And what'll happen is the state education officer will send me the theme, right? And then what happens is this is just supposed to be like thrown up in the lodge for discussion. So here, Illinois Masonic Education Themes, October. Entered Apprentice Charge, Paragraph 1. Notes and guided answers and discussion questions. Why is Masonry considered honorable? What does it mean to exchange the scepter for the trowel? Just things and bits of old types of ritual from 1867. So it's not about per se like guided curriculum. It's whatever you guys want to. But the problem is this: left unchecked, nobody will do anything.
And that gets absolutely, and that gets to, we talk about what kind of lodge are we. So we, as Masons and as leaders of a Masonic lodge, we have 3 jobs, and that's to initiate, pass, raise men from prospects to master Masons. How we get there, just like you said, is up to us. But we also have to instill the commitment of that person to want to be that, because if not, then that's where those little fractional groups come off. And so another question I saw in that group chat was like, well, are there other groups that are practicing other, groups of Masonry? And you could attest that, like, yeah, this can be one of those groups, because at the end of the day, like, we could go into a lodge, practice first, second, and third degree ritual, or we could come or come online and discuss deeper topics. So.
I think you nailed it with that, is that you can do whatever you want. But even in your worshipful master's charge, like when you're being installed, I'm betting there's something in there that says like you're supposed to read from the code so that nobody can feign ignorance of it. Right? How many times you've been to lodge where the master's like, okay, this week we're going to read code whatever? Like that. I mean, probably some lodges do it, some lodges don't, but it's pretty rare. But like what I posted that on the Illinois Lodge of Research.com, and anybody can go to that. That's not tiled. All the information's open and available and shareable with public. So if you guys feel like using that stuff, go nuts. It's available. You just download it and use it. Change it how you want to. But the point is to have those resources available. But yeah,
just looking at your website, like, because we often we dive down into like, what does this mean? Like, what does this mean? But just some of those questions. It's great to have those resources, and I certainly thank you, like, genuinely thank you for offering that as another resource for us. Cause just one of those questions I saw, what does it mean to exchange a scepter for the trial? That's an interesting question. That is, how many times have we thought about that? We talk about that charge, but
that's the thing too, is that somebody had asked about those other orders. And again, all these other orders are fantastic, but everything that you're looking for is in the ritual, really, if we want to look for it.
Absolutely.
And so there's a past Grandmaster, Akram Elias, and he is probably one of the most esoteric Masons I have ever met. And he's never stepped foot outside of Freemasonry. And that should tell you something.
I know, some guys like that too. And I think we're building some of those guys here in Sacramento Lodge number 40, because I think there's a lot of guys who understand the beauty and the purity and just how you can never stop growing or continuing to grow. And every time you look into that and to your ritual, you see like, wow, that's how maybe I can address something in my day-to-day life. And so, yeah, a lot of those answers, in my opinion, are in the quote-unquote Blue Lodge. So.
I just got to make one statement, and that's over the past 3 or 4 months that we've all been stuck at home, and so many lodges have been doing these online Zoom sessions. I want to say that, like, I've gotten more out of these sessions, being able to come together from different parts of the country and hear different talks and talk about different things than I've kind of gotten from the year or so that I was going to lodge. I love going to lodge, don't get me wrong, but I hope that this is one outcome of this whole thing that doesn't change, is that we still continue to do these Zoom sessions, and still continue to do these things between our lodges and between our different states, so that we can continue to communicate with one another. I think there's not enough of us sort of on the esoteric side. We're all spread out, right? And so it would be good to be able to come together. I don't know how we could do it, because we can't, obviously this isn't tiled, right? But come together in a way that we can discuss some of these topics and talk about the rituals and all that sort of stuff to get a deeper understanding of it. It doesn't always happen in every lodge.
Yeah, we hope that you take, when we do open back up, even though this is a new norm, I guess, in a way, and we can incorporate this into our day-to-days moving forward, or at least into our labor schedules, to take this kind of information back to your lodge and kind of reinvest it back into that and spark something new. And maybe you can change. Maybe you're that guy that changes the culture for your lodge, from the guys who like the cookies and ice cream at the end of it to today we're going to talk about the Kabbalah with the Q.
Or talk about this stuff while you're eating cookies and ice cream.
Right. Or that.
Right.
This is the beauty, right? Is I just got the email today that my Grandmaster says, okay, Governor says phase 4. That means we can meet again in July.
Congratulations.
That's great.
Okay. So for us, well, we're kind of like, ooh, we don't know, right? But most of my guys are like, okay, let's do it. We'll meet in the bigger hall. We'll spread out, go like this with your arms and sit down and don't sit next to anybody else and wear a mask. And the idea, though, like if you were going to stop these kind of Zoom conversations, if that falls by the wayside, then yeah, I think we just bring this back to lodge if you can. Is it Stephen? You got your hand up?
Yeah, speaking of someone who is in another order that already discusses esoteric things, my preference for the Masonry side would be the specific Blue Lodge applicable esoterics.
Yep, and I think that's the key. Is like when I was talking about keeping Freemasonry, and looking at those topics of esoteric thought within the context of Freemasonry. Something I've worked on for a while, I mentioned Akram Elias, is it's called Masonic Legacy Society. And basically it was founded on the life and principles of Bruce Fetzer, Johnny Fetzer, and the Fetzer Institute. What we've done there is we've taken just elements of Freemasonry, the universal aspects, worshipful masters, senior, junior wardens, and Tyler, and presented a way of meditative thought, thinking about things to further, a more introspective, esoteric look at Freemasonry. But that's the key, though, is it's all just Freemasonry. So it's applicable at any Masonic lodge in America, regardless. There's no Grand Master who can say that's not Masonic, because every bit of it is Masonic, and that's free. And if you're weird about putting your information in, just know that it comes to me.
I had something. This is Larry. Anyway, you were talking about the end of the esoteric in 1919. Do you have any idea why?
So what we see in like 1915, 1919 is really just the war. The war happens, and when our boys come home, the in vogue thing at that time is providing something of value for those guys who are coming home. We're dealing with not just the Spanish flu, not just the Depression, and of course just the interim between two great world wars. It's just kind of the way it happened. And when these things, we call it, I'm not assigning a negative connotation to the word dilution here. That's not what I mean. But this diluting of our Masonic fraternity, as we have all this huge influx of members, we kind of stop talking about these things. And that's just because, like I said, I talked about the supply and demand of the idea of dinner clubs. My grandparents, who both passed, I keep their books on my shelf, their picture books, and every couple pages, there they are at a new dinner club being social. It's like 1950, 1960, 1970. They start falling off, right? Because social practices and like going out and being social and getting together with your neighbors and doing these things kind of fall off on the wayside. But Freemasonry still had that. And so you see kind of like, we became more social. So Masonic became a social fraternity more than a school of living philosophy. And that's just my point of view on it. That's kind of what I've seen. But
Can I throw something out?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So
I'm not right.
just so, here, I'll throw this out to you. So in 1919, that's the when DMLA started for young men, and it was basically designed for young men who did not have fathers, that lost fathers in the First World War. So basically you had a change, to me, in Masonry to go to work on family, and they wanted to get past the war. So they kind of went more towards the social end of things and tried to include, and that's where you have the formation of the Masonic youth groups. So they've tried something different. I'm just looking at history. This is just my own opinion. I don't have research on it. I'm just giving you the way I was brought up. Yeah. And then over the years, you have the destruction of the family unit, and then you go into more or less the 70s, where people are not joiners anymore, and you have that whole thing, and from that it's just progressed. So getting back to the esoteric, that's wonderful. I've worked with DMLA, most of my life. And it all comes back to ritual. If you want these young men to be leaders and what have you, the ritual was written by Frank Marshall, who was a Scottish Rite Mason. And that's what it's all about. There are certain parts, and there is so much in the DMLA ritual, which basically comes from a lot of the Blue Lodge in different ways. It's kind of rewritten, but for the most part, it's there. But I think all of Masonry tried to do something different, and come to the 20th century, and this is where we're at now at this point in the 21st century. So what we do with the next 50 or 100 years is important.
The other thing to remember too is that you had in the 1800s, the late 1800s, you had an anti-Masonic political party. These people were literally trying to get candidates in who were anti-Masonic because they felt like Freemasons were in government and they were extending favors and stuff to other Masons, right? So you had an entire anti-Masonic party that was trying to get candidates in.
Hey, Aaron, can I ask you a favor?
Yeah.
All right. So I had this hypothesis that you just hit on, and I've not done any research on it, but I'd be curious to know. I've read, so I go through Grand Lodge proceedings for fun because I'm really dry, boring idiot. But one of the things that I see is I had this hypothesis that after the Morgan Affair, which leads to the anti-Masonic period, that we stopped doing weird stuff.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
by weird stuff, I mean, so my initial thought was, did we ever really call a Masonic lodge a temple? And did we stop calling it temple because it was weird?
Yes.
But I don't know the answer to that. So
in all the stuff that I've been reading about and looking at, it's like right when the anti-Masonic stuff started happening, it's sort of like when a lot of the heavy Christianization of stuff started happening, and you have the interesting thing is that like once that happened, then you have sort of like the explosion of the middle class after World War II. And so in the explosion of the middle class after World War II, everybody wanted to be a middle manager. And so joining a Masonic lodge sort of like was a way for a lot of middle class people to sort of get themselves ingratiated with their bosses who were Masons, right? Because previous to that, you had Masons who were sort of like upper class sort of folks, people of means who were sort of an elite, part of the elite, or at least that was a lot of the I guess the perception of people in the middle class, right? So you had all of these joiners, as you call it, joining Masonic lodges, 50s, 60s, 70s, who wanted to be, middle class people who wanted to be part of the elite, right? And so that's where I think for me, that's when I look back at all that stuff that's where most of the bulk of your supper club Masons stuff comes from, right? They weren't necessarily interested in the esoteric. They wanted to be part of a social class.
How did you in the world, and I keep looking at it, so I need to comment on it, get a Masonic longboard that's hanging up on your wall behind you?
Oh, it's because I longboard, dog.
That is so cool.
The story is a quick one, but basically, I do a lot of writing. So one of the things I did was I was charged by my boss to interview a guy named Mike who owns a place called Coda Longboards in Colorado. Coda Longboards stands for Knights of the Air. Mike is a retired Air Force guy, and he wanted to do something cool, so he made longboards. And so long story short, I did this interview. My writing style for a men's magazine is quite a bit different than anything I do for Masonry, so it's a lot of swearing and kind of Hunter S. Thompson-esque, I suppose. But anyway, I wrote this article about Coda Longboards and interviewed Mike, and my wife read it, and she asked me, she's like, "Oh man, you remember when you used to skateboard?" And I was like, "Yeah." And it was my Father's Day present. She called up Mike, and she had this custom board built, and it's got some, I mean, it was awesome because at the time I weighed more than I weigh now. And I was like, I can't ride a longboard. I will crack that shit in half. And Mike was the coolest. And he's like, no, I put so much camber in it. So I was like, oh, thanks, Mike. But anyway, that's the idea. And yeah, I probably haven't taken that one out in a year, but I probably should. It's summertime.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so cool. I've been staring at it. I was like, is that a lot? Like, I literally sat there for the longest time. Like, is that a...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is a custom made, yeah.
That's awesome.
Dan Valdez, I saw you had your hand up a few moments ago. If you want to slip in a last question or anything before you...
Okay. Yeah. This is a real quick question, but with me being still an intro apprentice, is there a boundary that I should not go beyond until I actually become a fellow craft when it comes to this?
I think that's what he was asking, was what not to look for or not to go past.
Oh yeah,
Is there a boundary as an entered apprentice?
Is there a boundary of being an entered apprentice?
I guess for like research and study.
I think every entered apprentice, every fellow craft, and every master mason should know. For instance, right now is a good time for the entered apprentice to really know the entire first degree inside and out. You know, like that's what I would do, and I encourage. I know we have our little blue books in California. I know our lodge, many a time the master masons have been like, yeah, you're gonna get the proficiency book. I'm also I'll buy another blue book, my own time, rip out the entered apprentice degree, staple it together. And we'll get after this, after you finish processing this after your degree. You know what I mean? So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, I have to agree. Dan, if you're an entered apprentice, there is so much to unpack. Arguably, you're gonna find guys who find that there's three kinds of masons, right? Entered apprentice lovers, fellow craft lovers, and master mason lovers, and there are going to be two other kinds of masons who think that the entered apprentice degree is the most important, and they're going to say the master mason is the most important. Traditionally speaking, the entered apprentice degree is likely Wilmshurst will disagree, right? Don't read Wilmshurst yet. But he says the third degree is the initiation. First and second lead up to it. But truly, your entered apprentice degree is your initiation. That's when a lot of this stuff happens, a lot of wake-up stuff happens. And I really think, not that you'll do yourself a disservice, it's just that, again, you learn math in a certain way, right? You learn addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, right? You follow a logical path because one builds on top of the other. And by jumping around, you just run the risk of, maybe perhaps confusing some things. But there's a couple books, if you can find it, it's a book by Anthony Mangelli. He left the fraternity, but he had a book, and it was called Selected Symbols of the Entered Apprentice Degree. And I think esoterically, it's a good entered apprentice book.
I mean, for me, I would say, don't read ahead, right? Like the surprise of it all, what you're going to go through, and part of it is the surprise, right? Part of it is if you go and spoil it for yourself, it's not going to have as much of an impact. And if you read entered apprentice stuff and you read fellow craft stuff, when you're in there, you'll understand it better, and then you can move on, right? I think, and sometimes I think a lot of lodges, they try to rush people through because they need to make masons, and it's good to, if you need to take the time to understand it better, take the time to understand it better. Don't get pushed into doing your proficiency.
I think understanding your proficiency too, like really knowing what it means, before you just jump into the next thing. It's so easy to just jump degrees, and then you completely miss the importance of the degrees while you're going through them. Like knowing what an E8 is, why are they, the bearers of burden? What is their role in the lodge, and what are the symbolisms behind it? Like know that, have a terrific understanding of that, utilize those aspects in your life, and then you're ready for further light.
Well, you got to figure first, second, and third degree. If all those tools are applied to you correctly, it's essentially and I don't want to say a purification by any means, but it really kind of cleanses you, and you ascend to a different, if you understand everything from the first, second, and third degree, then when you're actually, when you're being raised or whatnot, like it's a whole different feeling. You have a different understanding. Like that was my whole life. This is who I am now. but knowing and having these conversations and discussing everything from the way that our floors look to what that the winding staircase is and to what the occasion is, but yeah, Stephen.
I wouldn't avoid everything esoteric. I was in a whole different order, and I was deep into that before I became a Mason. But I specifically avoided anything Masonic before I became a Mason.
Right.
So just be specific about what you're avoiding if you don't want to spoil yourself. But there's a lot out there that you can delve into without spoiling yourself.
If I may, I think the magic in Masonry is exemplifying what you've learned. So when you go into Masonry, it's not so much learning, it's doing. So once you learn the entered apprentice, exemplify it. Not just do it. Be an embodiment of what that means, and then you're ready to move forward. And therefore, you're able to be a fellow craft and then a master Mason, and you can move forward from that.
That's some gnosis right there.
Right. You're from New York over there.
Sorry, bro. Every now and again, we got to chime in.
I listened to your recent interview, Right Worshipful, with Most Worshipful from DC. What's his name? I'm sorry.
We had Elias, Akram Elias. Yeah.
Excellent interview. Did you guys listen to that one? I was raised right outside of DC in Mount Vernon, Virginia. So seeing the, AW22 or, Alexandria and all that, and just it was different, I guess.
It does. And what I found interesting was when I had gone out to DC for the first time for some work, two things happened. My friend Jonathan and I decided to go to a first degree at Alexandria, Washington 22.
AW22.
And it was cool. And, right. So if you guys don't know, AW22, two things were neat about that. Number one, this dude who wrote this hit book, Andrew Hammer, was their secretary, and he was delivering a lecture. So Andy Hammer has this British accent, really interesting guy. But anyway, so that was really cool. Two was this lodge meets in the George Washington National Masonic Memorial. So that was pretty tight. But here was this is your bummer factor. All right. I want you to think about this. An entered apprentice degree with a world-class writer, a world-class lecturer, performing a degree at a national memorial. Guess how many sideliners?
Oh.
115.
4.
Oh.
Plus 7 lodge officers. So, the point is that the issues we face are everywhere, right? So just think about that. Like when you on any given night, you may have more brothers in your lodge than what you would consider the most kick-ass lodge in the world, right? The degree was amazing, and the guy who was getting a degree was, part of Central Intelligence stuff. Everybody's in coat and tails. I think a guy got kicked out once for not wearing black socks. I'm not entirely sure. That could be true. That might not be true.
I hope they were blue.
If they don't match your stuff, you're out.
Right.
I grew up in Fairfax, Virginia.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm from Fairfax, Virginia, and I have yet to go back. I want to go back and tour DC and do like a Masonic tour of DC and go see because I haven't been back since I was raised. And so,
oh man,
I want to go back with a whole different, fresh set of eyes to the place where I grew up. Because I used to play, go to the mall and all that stuff in DC all the time as a kid. But now I want to go back and see it with a different set of eyes, and I'm excited for that.
If you do, let me know. We have a brother from Sac40 who's a lobbyist down there, lives in DC, and he practices out there.
Oh, would love to. Absolutely, yes. Would love to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Robert Johnson. This was amazing. super appreciate everyone here at Sac40 and all of our guests. Really appreciate you coming in and speaking for us.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. So just remember, shoot me an email. I think Stephen, I shared the form with you, but the more of you that shoot me an email and fill out that peer review for me would be super cool, and it informs the way I deliver that lecture in the future. So if you found corrections or whatever, like Stephen had corrected me on OTO, which thank you, because now I won't say that again. And I'll go back and do some additional research because it makes it stronger. So just thanks guys for having me, and really quite an honor. Thank you.